It's another Mailbag Friday, so let's get into some more questions on this edition of Locked On Royals.
You are Locked On Royals, your daily Kansas City Royals podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I'm your host, Jack Johnson, and you can give me a follow on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. That's at JOHNYJ_15. Also, be sure to give us a follow on our now live accounts on Instagram and TikTok. Go give us a follow at Locked_on_Royals. Also, very easy to find us on wherever you listen to your podcast. That can be Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Amazon Music, and on YouTube. Just be sure to hit that follow button and subscribe. We're now around 615 subscribers, so already 15 more over the last week or so. Trying to get to 700 by Christmas, and then by opening day 2024, we hope to get up to about 1,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel. So really appreciate you guys continuing to push along this content throughout the off season. As for me, I just work here in Kansas City at Sports Radio 810 WHB. Got a show once a week over there. Got a show Monday through Friday on ESPN Kansas City, 10 to 11 a.m. So I stay pretty busy in the sports world. But when you come to this podcast, when you click on this podcast, you know that you are getting 30 straight minutes of Royals baseball, whether they're in season or they're out of season like they are right now. And then, of course, today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It is the perfect time to go and create your account today. Do so right after you listen to this podcast, and so start going and getting your bets in before the weekend. There's a big college basketball game here locally tonight, Kansas and UConn, top 5 matchup at Allen Fieldhouse. There's going to be great conference championship games on Saturday. There's a full slate of NFL games. I know here in Kansas City, Sunday night football between the Chiefs and the Packers. So if you can bet legally, go over to FanDuel, create your account, and start placing your bets. And as always, you can leave me comments and questions, whether that be on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15 or on YouTube. I'll try my best to get to those whenever I can go check in on our YouTube channel and get those questions answered. Because as we always like to do on a Friday is our Mailbag Friday segment. We had enough questions where we can turn this into 2 segments, which is always a good time because, 1, it's a Friday, and 2, there's a really big week coming up. We're going to have the MLB Draft Lottery. We talked about that in last night's podcast episode. We discussed the Rule 5 draft earlier this week. That's going to be coming up, and the winter meetings as well. There could be some free agent signings. There could be some trades, as I'm sure we're going to get some questions for that from our mailbag segment. So without further ado, let's move on and get to question number 1. This is from Chad on Twitter. If there's a trade due to the Hampton signing, the Garrett Hampton signing that happened 2 days ago, who do you think it is, Nick Loftin or Michael Massey? Who do you want it to be, Loftin or Massey? I would probably lean toward it being Nick Loftin if there is a trade, and here's a couple reasons as to why. You know, Michael Massey, as much as he struggled in 2023, he also played the entire year. And when you play the entire year, the defense was great over there. He's still a young piece. Like, the Royals take that into consideration, whereas Nick Loftin really only played in September. So the Royals would have to go into the offseason saying Nick Loftin, A, is a better player, B, is going to be a better player. The reality is they don't know if Nick Loftin is a better player right now, and that's what's going against Nick Loftin. He may be. I know that there's some people out there that say, well, look at Nick Loftin's numbers in September. Michael Massey was bad all year long. I don't think that's really the case. He got a lot better in the second half. But I think what the Royals want to do is solidify that infield. And they like Michael Massey a lot. They like his defense a lot. And Nick Loftin, though he is that super utility, I mean, you said it in the tweet, Chad, that somebody like Garrett Hampson is a super utility guy. Like, he then can take that spot from Nick Loftin. And I think the Royals are going into the season with him as their super utility guy and not so much Nick Loftin. So I believe it's going to be Nick Loftin. The other question you had there was, who do I want it to be? It's a fair question. I think I'm going to stay consistent with what I just said. I would want it to be Nick Lofton, not just because I think Michael Massey's got more experience under his belt. I think he's going to have a much better 2024. And number two, Nick Lofton can get you more in return. I think the unknown of the player that he is, and also having a former first-round title attached to his name, like that changes a lot of things. That can get you some value. When you have former first-rounder tied to your name, he had good numbers in September. He's young. He's got years of control. That can get you a better return than Michael Massey, who teams could go, well, he wasn't that good last year. And he's a second baseman, unlike Nick Lofton, who's a super utility guy. Like, I think I'm going for more value here. And if I'm going to make a trade, I'd rather get a pretty serious return, whether that be for the rotation or that be for the bullpen. But I think it would be Lofton, and I would rather it be Lofton than Michael Massey. Question number 2, we got from Esky on Twitter. No, not Alcides Escobar. With the Royals signing Garrett Hampson, it might mean a trade is coming. Who do you think the Royals could be targeting in a trade? We touched on this a little bit in that Garrett Hampson podcast that we did. I kind of agree with Alex Duvall. I don't want to say kind of. I do agree with Alex Duvall, the Royals Farm Report leader over there, once was, but still very active on Twitter. And he thinks it could be a domino type of move. Like, you don't go out there and sign Garrett Hampson and then not do any trade for it, really, because you don't want 2 or 3 super utility guys on the roster. That doesn't make any sense. And if Garrett Hampson's going to be on the Major League roster, well, a trade could be incoming. It's kind of a domino move. And you sign Garrett Hampson, that means you're flipping somebody else to bring in more pitching. A lot of moves could be happening here. It's kind of tough to tell who they would be targeting without knowing who they'd be offering up, right? If it's Nick Lofton, I mean, I think you could go out there and, I do think a great trade candidate would be somebody needing a right-handed bat off the bench. I always bring up the Giants because I thought they would be linked to Edward Olivares. Cincinnati feels really active right now. Nick Lofton could kind of fit that bench role. However, Cincinnati doesn't really have a pitcher that you could take on that really would be available and good enough to do so. I think it was Ryan Wynn for the Giants. I could be getting that name wrong, but I know good buddy Preston Farber at Royals Miners brought that up in the offseason, that he'd be somebody that you go after and target. I think there are a couple of guys in the National League Central that would interest me just a little bit. Brewers side prospect system. Maybe you can go the Chicago Cubs route because the Cubs, they're going to be spending. Like, that would be what I'm targeting. Go offer up Nick Lofton to a contending team because they're going to have more of a roster crunch. Now, they could take on Nick Lofton, stash him in AAA, but maybe they're trying to clear up some space so they can go out there and sign some pretty big-time players. Or maybe you go to the Yankees, who are going to be big-time spenders. You go to the Phillies, who are going to be big-time spenders. Like, that's who I'd be targeting rather than just trying to go get a super utility guy for a corner outfield bat. It has to be pitching, that's for sure. Just don't know if I've got a name out there right now that really, really intrigues me. Could change, though, in a couple of weeks. Last one we'll do before the break is from RB Carr on Twitter. He asked, reports are the Marlins are listing on calls for Edward Cabrera and Trevor Rogers, looking for catching and shortstop upgrades. Royals a match, Garcia for Cabrera straight up. Well, it's a good question, and we brought this up in our podcast. It was our podcast episode yesterday. If it was Michael Garcia for Edward Cabrera straight up, I'm saying no. I think you would need a little bit more of a return on that just because Edward Cabrera's injury concerns do concern me. Edward Cabrera's lack of inning work concerns me. And Michael Garcia, I think, is one little fix away from being an all-star type of third baseman, one of the best third basemen in all of baseball. Not sure I'm willing to give up on that just yet. But good question, as always, from RB Carr. Okay, we still have 4 more questions to get to in our Mailbag Friday segment, so we're not going to waste any more time. More questions on your way coming up on Locked On Royals. You are tuned into Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Jack Johnson, and you can follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Also, give us a follow on Instagram and TikTok at Locked_on_Royals. Before we answer more questions from our mailbag, let's give a shout out to the title sponsor today in FanDuel Sportsbook. As the weather gets colder, the NFL offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options that include spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. We got more questions on the way from our Mailbag Friday segment. And again, always be sure to send those over to me. Twitter's the best spot to do it at JohnnyJ_15. But also, if you want to try it on YouTube, going to get a lot better about answering questions over on that platform. Next question we got is from JDC on Twitter. He asked, do you think they will sign one pitcher for over $10 million per year this offseason, and who is possible? Yes, I would not bet my life savings on it, but I do believe the Royals are going to make a splash in their type of world for a starting pitcher. I mean, possibilities, I think Seth Lugo just makes the most sense because the Royals are notorious for kind of revisiting with guys that they once were interested in. I mean, we heard it yesterday from J.J. Picollo that they were interested in Garrett Hampson for a couple of years. Now, Seth Lugo, it was reported they were interested in him last year. So it kind of makes sense with what his price range is going to be and what the Royals need that he's a name you go after. He brings you stability at the top half of the rotation. I mean, you pencil him in as the opening day starter. That would be kind of a no-brainer to me. If they wanted to go like right around $10 million, because I think Seth Lugo would probably be a 2-year, $36 million deal, maybe 2-year, $35. So you're paying upwards of $15 million a year. But, you know, with pitching, you got to overpay a little bit. If you want to get closer to $10 million a year, Martin Perez, I think, makes a lot of sense. If you wanted to go bounce-back candidate, Jack Flaherty makes a lot of sense. I think he'll be about 1 year, $12 million, kind of in the same ballpark as Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson. All three of those options. Like, if I had to put some money down as to who's left, one of those three guys, I believe, will be a Royal, unless they're going to go the trade route. If they go the trade route, I think it changes up a lot of things here on who they're going to go after in free agency. But if they are going to go after free agency, it's one of those three guys to me. Next question we got here is from Matt. He said, why can't we just quit on this team? We know they aren't going to do what we want, so why do we continue to hurt ourselves? Well, that's fandom 101, right? And if you've been a Royals fan for your entire life, or maybe you jumped on the fandom in the 2014-2015 runs, you're more expecting greatness from the Royals. If you've been watching since the 80s, maybe you were expecting them to continue that trend all the way to the 90s and 2000s. If you just started watching in the 2000s, you're probably not always setting high expectations, but that is fandom 101. And it's also the beauty of the offseason, right? We do this every single year. If the Royals go in and lose 98 games next year, we're still going to have optimistic outlooks in the offseason because, as we said on our very first episode of the offseason, it was the best thing about this is the slate is wiped clean, completely clean. Like, there's no more record. The 2023 record doesn't matter anymore. It didn't make the postseason. Okay, so be it. Try to make it in the next season. That's optimism, right? The reason you don't quit on them is because you can kind of talk yourself into every single offseason the Royals just doing a little bit to make them more competitive. And it doesn't really matter whether they're good or bad in 2024 because you're going to do the exact same thing in the offseason in 2024. Like, that's fandom. That is fandom, whether it's baseball, it's basketball, it's the NFL. You do it. I mean, there's fan bases in the NFL, like the Patriots now, the Giants, that in the offseason, you'll talk yourselves into, well, we can make the postseason next year. You don't quit on your team. You don't. If you like that team, if you root for that team, there is nothing that'll change that. Like, I always struggle too late in the season for baseball when, fans start picking other teams to go and root for in the postseason. Like, I honestly can't. I don't have enough passion for it. There's teams I would hope would win over certain teams, but in terms of watching every single game, being invested, wanting to find a team that's fun to watch, I can't do it. There's only one team I can watch, only one team I truly care about, and that is, of course, the Kansas City Royals. Up next, we're going to get a question from Taco. He asks, what's the most money you think the Royals will spend on a player this offseason? Got to be pitching. And I think I'm going to go back to my Seth Lugo pick because Seth Lugo is what the Royals need. I would be shocked if they went and spent, north of $20 million on a player. I'd be shocked if they spent more than $10 million on a corner outfield bat they're looking for. I just don't think they want to go after somebody like a Lourdes Gurriel who's going to generate a lot of money. For their corner outfield bat, I think they'll get a little bit more creative. For the rotation, that's where you have to spend. You have to spend just a little bit more than people are expecting. And yeah, Seth Lugo, unless the Dodgers per se. The Dodgers were rumored to be interested in Seth Lugo, but they're interested in everybody. They're interested in the peanut guy in section 400 at Kauffman Stadium. Like there's not a single player out that the Dodgers are not interested in. But unless Seth Lugo is picked up here rather quickly, I just think that he's going to wind up in Kansas City. I could be way off base. I could be wrong, but I'm willing to stand by it because the Royals need pitching. They need a number one. And in the price range, if you want consistency, you want a guy that fits what the Royals are looking for, it's Seth Lugo. And I do think if it came down to it, like he's the guy they're offering the money to. And the fact they were interested last year only makes me think they're even more interested this year. Because now you don't have Zach Greinke. Now you don't have Brad Keller. You need to fill some holes on the rotation, and I think he fits that bill. So I'm going to go with Seth Lugo. They would spend a good amount of money to bring him into Kansas City. And lastly, Zach asked on Twitter, you think if Salvador Perez doesn't get moved during the winter meetings, do you think it'll happen at all? I still think there's a chance that it happens if Salvi's not traded in the winter meetings. Because if he's not traded in the winter meetings, which I'm going into this next week not anticipating it, we just haven't heard anything since the trade deadline last year. The fact that it's been so quiet, and maybe they're just keeping it under wraps, and I don't think – see, that's the thing. I don't believe J.J. Picollo would do that to the fan base. Like, quiet, all of a sudden, bombshell, Salvador Perez is traded. I mean, this is the Royals Hall of Famer we're talking about. If Salvador Perez is getting traded, we're going to know about it, or that the Royals are interested in trading him and he's interested in being traded a couple of days before it happens, maybe a week or two before it happens. It's not going to be some bombshell. What that does make me think, though, is it's still possible, to answer your question, Zach, because if they're not going to do it at the winter meetings, I think they're going to gauge where the Royals are at number one and how Salvi plays in the first half. If Salvi plays in the first half like a 2021 version of himself and he stays healthy, well, we got a different conversation here. I mean, that's a no-brainer to try and flip Salvador Perez at the deadline. Because last year, he was willing to waive his 10-5 rights. You felt like you had a deal in place, but kind of last minute it fell through. And that was with Salvi not really hitting well. And he was banged up most of the year, most of the first half. And that was, pretty close, I would say, to getting a trade done. But if Salvi returns to form and he stays healthy, like I would put it more than 50% for sure that he's getting traded at the deadline. Just because they were interested in doing it last year, and I never thought they would be. But just because they don't do it at the winter meetings, I don't think means that they're not doing it at all. I think they could revisit that at the deadline. They just need to assess where the Royals are at that point in time, whether they are still in a wild card hunt, divisional hunt, or nothing at all. And if it's nothing at all, I'd imagine that they are going to try to find a suitor for Salvador Perez and bolster that, minor league level, that minor league system just a little bit more. Well, those are all our questions from the Mailbag Friday. Always keep them coming. We always love answering questions. And even if it's past the time we post this, I'll try to answer your questions on Twitter. Do that at JohnnyJ_15 or on YouTube at Locked On Royals. Before we go to break and wrap up with our final segment of the week, want to give a shout out to something we're very excited about here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and that's Locked On Sports Today, because it's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts on Locked On Plus, our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. So after this, go and subscribe on YouTube to Locked On Sports Today. We wrap up the show and the week next on Locked On Royals. You are tuning to Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Jack Johnson. You can be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. Also give us a follow on Instagram and on TikTok at Locked_on_Royals. We'll always appreciate the questions that we get in our Mailbag Friday segment. I enjoy doing it. We do it every single Friday. And just a little bit of a programming note, those are not going away. And once we drop down to 3 episodes a week, even if, we record the podcast on a Thursday, it's going to go out on a Friday. So we'll have our Mailbag Fridays, because if you're tuning in for the first time, after next week, after the winter meetings conclude, we will go from 5 episodes a week down to 3 episodes a week. So we will just have a little bit in a content cutback just because it's the off season. Everybody's going to be doing it in the baseball world and the Locked On Podcast Network. Give us a little bit more of a break because the news is going to slow down a little bit after the winter meetings. But building up to it, we know there's going to be a lot of content coming out, and we're still going to give you 5 episodes next week and hopefully a lot to talk about. Draft lottery, Rule 5 draft, and the winter meetings. Hopefully the Royals will be very, very busy next week, and we will have nothing but content to go over for the 2023 offseason, heading into the 2024 regular season. The last thing I wanted to dive into in the week involves a guy that I think at one point in time we had written off. At one point in time, we'd started to believe in again. Then we wrote off again. Then we started to believe in. And then this injury happened. And we kind of forgot about it. Like we don't really care about what happened back in April because the Royals were never consistently competitive. I mean, after April, after the first couple days of the season, we knew where the season was headed. We knew where the 2023 campaign was going. And Kris Bubic, surprisingly, was one of the few bright spots in 2023, at least April of 2023. Like the 3 or 4 starts he made, that was what you had to hang on to. I mean, it made everybody feel better about the coaching staff, made everybody feel better about Brian Sweeney. So if you can fix Kris Bubic, who else can you fix out there? Who else on this rotation? Who else in the bullpen can this coaching staff fix? And that, to me, was exhilarating, especially since you had been coming from the Cal Eldred season and the Cal Eldred era. With that happening, I mean, it's refreshing to see. It's refreshing to see a pitcher that traditionally had struggled look really good. But then he gets hurt, has Tommy John surgery. He's sidelined for the rest of the year. Surgery goes well. That's always the best case scenario. And now we're kind of going into 2024, I think, hoping that Kris Bubic comes back, that Kris Bubic can give you a little something in this upcoming year. It is always incredibly tough to come back from Tommy John surgery. I mean, that's not just Kris Bubic. That's not just left-handed pitchers. That's any pitcher in baseball. And we hadn't really seen Kris Bubic pitch at a high level. And that's not just, major leagues, AAA, AA, high A. We're talking just in terms of success. We hadn't seen him pitch that well before. Like he was there in the COVID year, wasn't super impressed. He was all right in 21, 22. He wasn't very good. And then in 2023, you had seen this spark. And it was good enough for me to go, all right, Kris Bubic is somebody I want to see the rest of the year. Where does this take him? Because if he turned things around, if he can find something, one, that's going to make me believe that Brian Sweeney can fix just about anybody in this rotation. And number 2, he can maybe become one of your steals of the 2018 draft class. Like he can fit that mold. And if he does, you can start feeling better about this pitching development. But once that injury happens, I'd be lying if I told you that I wasn't, taking it as, all right, well, that really is the end. I would be lying if I was being overly positive about, well, we saw a little good of Kris Bubic, and now we can wait, and next year he'll be back, he'll be the same guy. Like, if I said that to you, I'd be lying. I took more of the negative approach. I know I mixed up my wording there, but I took more so the negative approach of that's really unfortunate for him. Feel gutted for the guy because this was his evaluation year. He needed this. And the fact he didn't get it, and now you go into this offseason, like, you can't go into 2024 banking on Kris Bubic to show what he once was for 3 or 4 starts. And that's a sad reality. But it's also the cutthroatness of Major League Baseball and how the Royals should be operating. You know, if Kris Bubic comes back and he's effective, great. No, fantastic. And even if he's healthy by spring training, he can be a guy that goes out there and, you know, gives you some relief, gives you some depth. And that's something that J.J. Picollo wants. It didn't necessarily have to be from free agency or through trade. Like, if Kris Bubic comes back stronger than ever and he looks just as good as he did last year, I'd love to see him in Kansas City in 2024. But I just can't bank on it. That's the unfortunate part here. Like, I'm not going into the calendar year expecting him to come back and look the exact same. It's just not a likely scenario. I'm hoping I'm wrong. This is one of those scenarios I hope I am way wrong. And maybe I will be. I've been wrong before, and I'll admit it first thing. Because I do want to see Kris Bubic return to that form. I don't know if I can buy it right now. Same thing with Daniel Lynch. Like, both those guys, you know, even Brady Singer, like, I can't bank on it. I need to see it firsthand. And not just in spring training. I need to see it early on in the regular season. Who knows the health of Kris Bubic at that point. Well, that is going to do it for another edition of Locked On Royals on the Locked On Podcast Network. I've been your host, Jack Johnson. Always be sure to give me a follow on Twitter at JohnnyJ_15. And one last shout out to something we're very happy about here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and that's Locked On Sports Today. It's here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. We will have plenty to get into next week with the draft lottery, the Rule 5 draft, and winter meetings. So you enjoy a short weekend, and we'll be back with plenty of content to go over on Locked On Royals. You take it easy, Kansas City.